I used to think the cruelest thing a person could do was bury someone they loved. I was wrong. The cruelest thing was forcing someone to watch their life being erased while they were still standing there. My name is Brittany Stewart, and on the morning my stepmother called me a worthless burden, I honestly believed I had already survived the hardest year of my life. My father had been gone for 8 months, and every sunrise since his funeral had felt strangely quieter than the last, as if the entire neighborhood understood something precious had disappeared forever. Our small suburban street outside Charleston, South Carolina, still looked exactly the way it always had, with trimmed lawns, maple trees lining the sidewalks, and neighbors walking their dogs before work, yet nothing felt familiar anymore because the one person who had made that house feel like home was gone. My father had been the kind of man who fixed broken fences for neighbors without being asked, remembered every birthday in the family, and somehow believed every problem could be solved if people simply treated each other with enough kindness. I spent most of my childhood believing that kindness could protect you. It took only a few months after his funeral to discover how wrong I had been. Deborah Stewart, my stepmother, had never openly disliked me while my father was alive. She smiled at church, complimented my grades, and reminded everyone how proud she was that I planned to become a nurse. Looking back, I realize most of those smiles disappeared the day we lowered my father's casket into the ground. At first the changes were small. Family photographs vanished from the living room shelves. Dad's favorite leather chair disappeared after she claimed it looked outdated. His fishing gear was donated without asking me whether I wanted to keep any of it. Then came the larger decisions. She sold his pickup truck, canceled memberships he had treasured, and started talking about the house as though it were nothing more than another piece of property waiting to become cash. Every conversation seemed to end with the same sentence. Your father would have wanted us to move on. I never argued because I honestly did not have the energy anymore. I had just graduated from nursing school after years of balancing classes, clinical rotations, late-night studying, and part-time jobs. My father had attended my white coat ceremony despite already feeling sick, smiling through pain he never admitted was getting worse. Before he died, he squeezed my hand inside a hospital room and whispered something that stayed with me every single day. Finish what you started, Em. No matter what happens, finish. So I did. I graduated exactly the way I had promised him I would. I expected that finishing school would finally make life easier. Instead, it became the moment Deborah decided she no longer needed to pretend. That Friday morning began quietly enough. I woke before sunrise, made coffee in the same kitchen where Dad used to read the newspaper, and opened my laptop to check the status of several nursing applications I had submitted to hospitals around Charleston. I wanted to contribute financially until I could afford a place of my own, and although the grief still lingered, I finally felt something close to hope. Then I heard heels striking the hardwood floor behind me. Deborah did not return my good morning. She placed a folder on the kitchen counter and folded her arms. You need to pack today, she said with a calmness that somehow sounded colder than shouting ever could. I looked up, assuming I had misunderstood. Pack for what? She sighed dramatically, almost annoyed that I required an explanation. I've decided it's time for you to leave. I laughed once, not because anything was funny, but because my brain refused to accept the words. Leave? This is my home too. Her expression never changed. Not anymore. I reminded her that I had just finished school and needed a little time to secure a nursing position. I even offered to pay part of the utilities until I found full-time work. She dismissed every suggestion before I could finish speaking. According to Deborah, I was taking up space, slowing down her future, and refusing to grow up. The strange part was not the accusations themselves. It was how rehearsed they sounded, as though she had practiced this conversation for weeks. I walked upstairs in disbelief and stared around my bedroom, the same room where my father had helped me paint the walls pale blue when I was 13. Every shelf held memories he had quietly built with me over the years. I packed carefully, trying not to cry because crying somehow felt like admitting she had already won. 2 suitcases, 1 backpack, and a small cardboard box held nearly everything I owned. By the time I carried the last box downstairs, Deborah had already unlocked the front door. She did not offer help. She simply watched as I stepped onto the porch carrying the final load. The summer air felt heavier than usual, and several neighbors slowed their morning walks after noticing luggage scattered across the front lawn. Embarrassment settled over me long before anger did. I turned back toward the doorway, hoping that maybe this had gone far enough and she would finally soften. Instead, she pushed my largest suitcase off the porch so it landed on the grass with a dull thud. Then, loud enough for anyone nearby to hear, she looked directly into my eyes and said, "Get out, bitch." The street fell silent. Even the neighbors stopped pretending not to watch. My heart pounded so loudly I could barely hear anything else as I reached for the suitcase, but before I could lift it, an elderly man from 3 houses down slowly walked toward me with something small clutched tightly in his hand, glanced nervously at Deborah, and quietly whispered, "Brittany, your father told me there would come a day when only you could have this." The old man held the small wooden box with both hands as though it contained something far more valuable than money. His name was Timothy Jenkins, and he had lived 3 houses down on the opposite side of the street for longer than I had been alive. My father often joked that Timothy noticed every squirrel, every delivery truck, and every new family before anyone else did. He had been my father's closest friend in the neighborhood, although they rarely talked about anything serious where other people could hear. Timothy looked over his shoulder toward the front porch, lowering his voice until I almost had to lean closer to hear. "Him. Your father came to my house about 3 weeks before he passed away. He knew he was running out of time. He told me to keep this hidden unless the day ever came when you had nowhere else to go." My fingers trembled as I accepted the box. It was surprisingly heavy for something small enough to fit inside both hands. The wood had faded over the years, and my father had carved a simple letter B into the lid, the same way he used to carve our initials into handmade Christmas ornaments every December. Just seeing his handwriting brought an ache to my chest that I had worked so hard to keep under control. Timothy gently squeezed my shoulder. He said only you should open it. Nobody else. Timothy hesitated before adding, "Roy also left me a sealed card with a telephone number. He told me never to call it unless you were forced out of this house or left without somewhere safe to stay. I made the call shortly after you drove away." Before I could thank him, the front door slammed open behind us. Deborah stepped onto the porch with her arms crossed, her expression hardening the instant she saw the box in my hands. "What exactly is that?" she demanded. Timothy straightened his back. "Something Roy wanted Brittany to have." Deborah walked toward us without hesitation. "Roy is gone. Everything he left belongs to this household." Her words sounded rehearsed, almost automatic, as though ownership mattered more to her than memory ever had. I instinctively held the box against my chest. "Dad wanted me to have it." She laughed softly, shaking her head. "You keep saying that, Brittany, but you have absolutely no proof." Several neighbors were still standing nearby, pretending to organize mailboxes or adjust flower pots while quietly listening. The uncomfortable silence made every word feel louder. Deborah reached forward before I realized what she intended to do. Her fingers wrapped around one side of the box while I held the other. For one frozen second neither of us moved. Then she pulled sharply. The lid flew open. A folded envelope slipped onto the sidewalk beside us. A small brass key bounced across the concrete. A heavy metal coin rolled in a slow circle before stopping against the edge of my shoe. Everything seemed to happen in complete silence. I quickly knelt and picked up the coin first. It was unlike anything I had ever seen. One side displayed a gold eagle above an anchor and trident surrounded by carefully engraved lettering. The other side carried a navy insignia with details so precise that every line reflected sunlight. It felt substantial in my palm, not decorative like a souvenir but crafted with purpose. I turned it over several times, searching for some explanation that never appeared. Deborah bent down and snatched the envelope before I could reach it. My heart immediately sank because I recognized my father's handwriting across the front. "Brittany. Open only when you truly stand alone." I stepped toward her. "Please give it back." Instead of answering, she opened the envelope herself. Her eyes scanned the first few lines. Whatever she read caused the slightest change in her expression, not sadness or surprise but something closer to irritation. Before I could react, she tore the letter cleanly down the middle. Then again. And again. Small pieces drifted onto the grass like pale leaves carried by a summer breeze. I stared at the torn paper in disbelief. It felt as though I had just watched someone erase the last conversation I would ever have with my father. Timothy looked genuinely horrified. "Deborah, that was not yours." She shrugged without apology. If Roy wanted Brittany to know something important, he should have said it while he was alive. Those words settled over me with a weight heavier than grief itself. For a brief moment I wanted to gather every scrap of paper from the lawn and somehow piece the message back together, but the fragments had already scattered in different directions. Whatever my father had written was gone. Or so I believed. I carefully placed the brass key into my backpack and closed my fingers around the navy coin. It was the only thing she had not managed to take from me. I studied it once more, hoping it might offer some clue about why my father considered it important enough to hide. Nothing about his life suggested any connection to elite military units. He had been a commercial marine. Electrician for most of his career, practical, dependable, and never interested in talking about himself. If he had known someone connected to the Navy, he had certainly never mentioned it to me. Timothy looked as though he wanted to explain more, but before he could speak, Deborah interrupted again. "You have wasted enough time standing in my yard. I have buyers returning tomorrow to discuss an offer, and I expect everything that belongs to you to be gone before sunrise." Buyers. The word echoed in my mind. My father had always promised this house would remain our family's home. He had spent years restoring it room by room with his own hands. Selling it only 8 months after his death felt impossible to imagine, yet Deborah sounded completely certain. I loaded my suitcases into the trunk of my aging sedan with Timothy quietly helping me despite my repeated attempts to stop him. As I closed the trunk, he slipped something tiny into my hand without Deborah noticing. It was a folded piece of paper no larger than a business card. "I found this caught inside the box after she tore up the letter," he whispered. "I think it belongs to you." I waited until I sat behind the steering wheel before unfolding it. There were only 7 handwritten words in my father's unmistakable handwriting. "Keep the coin. They will recognize it immediately." I sat in my car for several minutes without turning the key, reading the 7 words over and over until they no longer felt like ordinary handwriting but like my father speaking directly to me one last time. "Keep the coin. They will recognize it immediately." Who were they? The question refused to leave my mind. I turned the heavy coin between my fingers again, tracing every engraved detail with my thumb. It did not look like something anyone could simply purchase at a gift shop. It looked personal, earned, and deeply meaningful. Yet my father had never served in the military. At least, not that I knew of. Every story he had ever told me involved repairing electrical systems on commercial vessels, teaching me how to change a flat tire, or reminding me that character mattered more than success. Military operations had never been part of those conversations. I finally started the engine and drove toward the small extended stay hotel where I could afford 2 nights using the savings I had set aside while finishing nursing school. The room was clean but plain, with beige walls, a tiny kitchenette, and a window overlooking a parking lot instead of the oak trees outside the home where I had grown up. For the first time since losing my father, I truly felt homeless. I unpacked only the essentials, placing the brass key and the coin carefully on the nightstand before sitting quietly on the edge of the bed. The silence allowed memories I had not visited in years to return unexpectedly. One memory surfaced more clearly than the others. I had been 12 years old when my father took me to a marina just outside Charleston on a windy Saturday morning. We were supposed to spend the day fishing, but the weather turned rough much earlier than expected. I remembered seeing emergency vehicles near one of the docks after a small private boat collided with a maintenance structure during the storm. Several people rushed toward the water while my father immediately ran to help without hesitation. I stayed behind with another family, frightened and confused, watching adults move quickly while paramedics arrived. Nearly an hour later my father returned soaked from the rain with a tired smile and told me everything would be all right. That evening, after we finally arrived home, someone knocked on our front door. A tall man stood outside wearing plain clothes with his arms secured in a medical sling. I had never seen him before. He thanked my father quietly for helping save his life after the accident and apologized for interrupting dinner. Dad invited him inside, but the man politely declined. Instead, he reached into his jacket and handed my father something small that fit in the palm of his hand. At the time I assumed it was some kind of commemorative coin because both men smiled as they looked at it. Before leaving, the stranger shook my father's hand firmly and said words that seemed oddly dramatic to my 12-year-old ears. "If your family ever needs us, we will come." Dad simply nodded and replied, "I hope." That day never arrives. For years I had dismissed the exchange as adults speaking in mysterious ways children were never meant to understand. Sitting alone inside that hotel room, I suddenly realized the object the stranger handed my father might have been the very coin now resting on the nightstand beside me. The possibility sent a chill through me. If that memory was accurate, then my father had kept the coin hidden for more than a decade. More importantly, he had expected me to receive it one day. I reached for my phone and searched online using every description I could think of. Military challenge coin. Navy special operations coin. Eagle anchor trident coin. Hundreds of images appeared, many similar but none identical. Every article repeated the same basic idea. Challenge coins were often presented as symbols of trust, service, respect, or membership. Some represented achievements. Others represented lifelong promises. That final phrase lingered in my thoughts. Lifelong promises. Before I could continue searching, my phone rang. The caller identification displayed an unfamiliar local number. I answered cautiously. "Brittany Stewart," a professional male voice asked. "Yes. My name is Asher Roberts. I am calling from Henderson Realty. Your name and telephone number appeared in an older property file connected to the Stewart residence. Because Deborah has represented herself as the person authorized to sell the property, I wanted to confirm whether you had been informed about tomorrow's proposed purchase agreement. I wanted to verify whether you would be present tomorrow afternoon." My stomach tightened immediately. Why would I need to be there? There was a brief pause before he answered. "According to the information we received, the parties are scheduled to sign a preliminary purchase agreement, after which the title company will begin its final ownership review." I struggled to keep my voice steady. Nobody informed me about any sale meeting. "I apologize if there has been a misunderstanding," he replied. "I simply wanted to confirm attendance because several parties will be present." After ending the call, I stared at the phone in disbelief. Deborah had wasted no time. She intended to sell the house immediately, and she had not even bothered telling me officially. If Deborah secured a signed purchase agreement, stopping the sale could become far more complicated and expensive. I looked toward the brass key lying beside the coin. Until that moment I had almost forgotten about it. It was small, old-fashioned, and carried no identifying marks except a tiny engraved number on one side. I wondered whether it belonged to a safety deposit box, a storage locker, or something else my father had quietly prepared. I slipped both the key and the coin into my purse, determined not to let either out of my sight again. Early the next morning I drove past the house from a distance instead of stopping. 2 luxury vehicles were already parked outside, and I watched a private home inspector examining the exterior while Deborah greeted the prospective buyers. She was behaving as though the sale were already complete. I started to pull away, but just before leaving I noticed Timothy standing across the street. He caught my eye, raised one hand urgently, and pointed toward the entrance of the neighborhood, where 2 dark sport utility vehicles with government-style license plates had just turned onto our street. I looked from Timothy toward the entrance of the neighborhood, where the 2 dark sport utility vehicles had just slowed to a stop near the curb. Their windows were heavily tinted, and their quiet, deliberate arrival drew curious glances from neighbors who had been walking their dogs or collecting the morning newspaper. Timothy hurried across the street as soon as traffic cleared, breathing a little harder than usual but determined to reach me before I drove away. Did you notice those vehicles? He asked quietly. I shook my head. No. Who are they? He lowered his voice. One of the men stopped outside my house before sunrise. He confirmed Roy Stewart's address, thanked me for making the call, and said they would take it from there. They'd been waiting near the neighborhood entrance ever since. His words immediately pulled my thoughts back to the challenge coin resting safely inside my purse. I tried to dismiss the connection as coincidence, but something deep inside me refused to let it go. I tried to dismiss the connection as coincidence, but something deep inside me refused to let it go. Timothy studied my expression for a long moment before speaking again. Brittany, your father was not the kind of man who believed in coincidences. If he told you to keep that coin, I think you should keep it close today. I thanked him and watched as he slowly returned to his yard. For a few seconds I considered driving away and forgetting everything. After all, I had no invitation to whatever was happening at the park, and I certainly had no reason to believe it involved me. But another problem demanded my attention first. The scheduled purchase agreement meeting. If Deborah persuaded the buyers to sign that afternoon, every room my father had lovingly restored would legally belong to someone else. I drove to a nearby coffee shop across from the real estate office, arriving nearly an hour before the scheduled appointment. From my seat beside the front window I could clearly see people entering the building carrying folders, briefcases, and legal documents. Shortly before noon a luxury sport utility vehicle pulled into the parking lot. Deborah stepped out wearing an expensive cream-colored business suit and oversized sunglasses, smiling confidently as she greeted a middle-aged couple who appeared to be the prospective buyers. She laughed easily, pointing toward photographs displayed on a sales brochure as though she were already celebrating. Watching her from across the street felt strangely surreal. Only 24 hours earlier she had thrown my belongings onto the lawn. Now she looked completely relaxed, convinced that nothing could interrupt her plans. I reminded myself to stay calm. Anger would not solve anything. Facts would. Unfortunately, I did not have many facts left. The letter my father wrote had been destroyed. The brass key had no label. The challenge coin carried no explanation. All I possessed were scattered memories and 7 handwritten words that made less sense with every passing hour. As I reached for my coffee, my phone vibrated. The caller identification displayed an unknown number again. I answered cautiously. Miss Stewart, a calm female voice asked. Yes. This is Rebecca Lawson with Charleston Memorial Hospital. We reviewed your nursing application and would like to schedule an interview as soon as possible. Relief washed over me so unexpectedly that I almost forgot where I was. We arranged an interview for the following morning, and after thanking her several times, I ended the call feeling hopeful for the first time since leaving home. My father had always believed that one good piece of news could give a person enough strength to survive several bad ones. I smiled despite everything happening around me. Then my attention returned to the real estate office just as Deborah and the buyers disappeared inside. My brief moment of hope faded. If the purchase agreement was signed before sunset, a new job would not bring back my childhood home. I crossed the street and quietly entered the lobby, hoping only to learn what was happening. The receptionist looked up politely. May I help you? My name is Brittany Stewart. I believe there's a proposed property sale involving my family's home today. She searched her computer, then looked back at me with professional courtesy. One moment, please. A few minutes later Asher Roberts, the same agent who had called me the previous evening, stepped into the lobby. His friendly expression changed slightly when he recognized me. Miss Stewart, thank you for coming. I was actually surprised you were not already inside. Nobody invited me, I admitted. His eyebrows lifted almost imperceptibly. That is unusual. Before he could continue, several people near the front windows suddenly turned toward the parking lot. The 2 dark sport utility vehicles I had seen near the neighborhood pulled into adjacent spaces outside the real estate office. Their engines stopped almost simultaneously. Conversations inside the lobby faded as 6 men stepped out, although only 3 approached the building. They wore sharply tailored dark civilian suits rather than combat uniforms, but their disciplined posture and coordinated movements immediately distinguished them from ordinary visitors. The tallest man appeared to be in his early 40s, with short dark hair touched by gray. He spoke briefly to the two men beside him, then the three of them walked directly toward the office entrance with the calm certainty of people who already knew whom they had come to find. I watched the three men cross the street with steady, unhurried confidence, and what struck me most was not their expensive suits or disciplined posture but the complete absence of drama in their movements. They were not looking around to see who was watching them. They were not trying to impress anyone. They simply walked with the quiet certainty of people who already knew exactly why they had come. Conversations around us faded into whispers as more neighbors gathered along the sidewalks. Several people pulled out their phones, assuming something important was happening, while others simply stared in silence. Even the buyers who had been smiling only minutes earlier now stood beside Deborah with expressions of open curiosity. Asher Roberts remained near the entrance, politely holding the glass door open as everyone instinctively stepped aside. The tallest of the three men entered first. He appeared to be in his early 40s with short dark hair touched by a few strands of gray and the calm expression of someone who had spent years making difficult decisions without raising his voice. The other two remained only a step behind him, equally composed. Nobody spoke until the lead operator removed a pair of dark sunglasses and looked slowly across the room. His eyes moved from face to face, careful and deliberate, as though confirming identities from memory instead of photographs. Finally, he asked, in a calm, respectful tone that carried effortlessly through the silent office, "Which one of you is Brittany Stewart?" Every head turned toward me at once. I froze for a heartbeat before quietly raising my hand. "I am Brittany." He looked directly into my eyes for several seconds, studying my face with an expression that felt strangely familiar despite the fact that I had never seen him before. Then he gave a slight nod, almost as though he had just confirmed something important. "Miss Stewart, thank you for staying." Deborah let out a short laugh behind me, breaking the silence. "This has to be some kind of mistake," she said confidently. "My stepdaughter does not know anyone in the military." The lead visitor acknowledged her with nothing more than a brief glance before returning his attention to me. "Would you mind if I asked you a question?" I nodded. "Do you have something that once belonged to Roy Stewart?" My heart immediately jumped. Slowly, without taking my eyes off him, I reached into my purse and wrapped my fingers around the challenge coin. The room remained completely still as I placed it in my open palm. The moment the officer saw it, his expression changed. Not dramatically, but unmistakably. He smiled with quiet recognition. "May I?" he asked. I handed him the coin. Instead of simply examining it, he reached into his own pocket and removed another challenge coin that looked almost identical. He placed the two coins side by side on the reception counter. Gasps spread quietly through the office. The designs matched with remarkable precision except for one small engraving near the edge. When he carefully aligned both coins together, the engraved markings connected perfectly to form a complete insignia that neither coin displayed alone. I stared in disbelief. My father had somehow possessed one half of a matched pair for more than a decade. The officer looked at me again. Roy kept his promise. My pulse quickened. "You knew my father?" Before he could answer, Deborah stepped forward with an impatient smile. "Excuse me, but whatever this is, we are in the middle of negotiating a lawful property transaction. If this concerns family memorabilia, perhaps you could schedule another time." The officer remained completely courteous. "Ma'am, we are not here regarding memorabilia." She folded her arms. "Then what exactly are you doing here?" He answered without changing his calm tone. "We are here because Timothy Jenkins called a private number Roy left with him more than a decade ago. Timothy was instructed to use it only if Brittany was ever forced from her home without somewhere safe to go." I turned toward Timothy in disbelief. He lowered his eyes and gave a small, apologetic nod. "Your father made me promise not to tell you unless the call ever became necessary," he said. Those words settled over the room like complete silence. I felt my breath catch. Yesterday. The day I had been forced out. The timing seemed impossible. Deborah shook her head dismissively. Safe? That is ridiculous. She is an adult. She moved out because she refused to contribute. The officer did not argue. Instead, he simply asked me another question. Miss Stewart, were you voluntarily leaving your residence yesterday? I hesitated only long enough to tell the truth. No. Were your belongings placed outside before you had secured another place to live? Yes. Did anyone provide reasonable notice or alternative accommodations? No. He nodded once more before carefully returning my father's coin to my hand. Thank you. The office remained silent as everyone waited for someone to speak first. Asher Roberts looked increasingly uncomfortable as he glanced between Deborah and me. The prospective buyers quietly exchanged uncertain looks. Whatever confidence had filled the building an hour earlier had completely disappeared. Deborah forced another laugh that sounded noticeably less convincing than before. This is absurd. Are we really interrupting a purchase agreement meeting over a family disagreement? The officer turned toward her for the first time. His expression remained respectful, but there was unmistakable firmness in his voice. No, ma'am. We are here because Roy Stewart asked us, many years ago, to make certain his daughter would never stand alone if she ever faced a moment exactly like this. My heart pounded so loudly I barely heard the quiet murmur spreading through the room. The promise from the marina. The stranger at our front door. The hidden coin. Suddenly every memory began fitting together. I swallowed hard before asking the question I had been carrying since Timothy handed me the wooden box. Who are you? The officer held my gaze for a long moment before answering. My name is Commander Lucas Jackson. I currently serve in the United States Navy, and the two men with me were members of the team your father helped that day. He paused just long enough for every person in the room to focus entirely on his next sentence. And your father once saved my life. I could not answer immediately because my mind had already traveled back to that rainy afternoon at the marina when I was 12 years old. The injured man standing on my front porch had seemed grateful, but I had never imagined that quiet stranger and the composed officer standing before me were the same person. Commander Lucas Jackson seemed to recognize the realization on my face before I found the words. He smiled gently. You remember the storm? I nodded slowly. I remember my father coming home soaked. I remember you thanking him. I thought it was just a boating accident. Lucas looked down briefly at the challenge coin resting in my hand before speaking again. To everyone else, it was. The operation connected to it was classified at the time. Most of those details have since been declassified, but Roy never repeated what he saw, even after there was no longer anything for him to gain by remaining silent. The room remained perfectly still as he continued. The weather forced our team to alter a scheduled movement along the coast. During that change, one of our support boats experienced a serious mechanical failure after striking submerged debris near the marina. Your father happened to be at the marina with you that morning, and his years of experience as a marine electrician allowed him to recognize the danger before most people understood what was happening. While everyone else hesitated because of the rough water, Roy climbed aboard without asking who we were or why we were there. He only saw people who needed help. Lucas's voice never became dramatic. If anything, the quiet respect with which he spoke made every sentence feel even more sincere. He stabilized the electrical systems that were failing, helped us safely reach the dock, and never asked for recognition afterward. When federal investigators later questioned witnesses, your father protected details that had nothing to do with the accident itself because he understood that some information could place other people at risk if it became public. I looked down, trying to picture my father doing all of that without ever mentioning it afterward. It sounded exactly like him. He had always believed that doing the right thing did not require an audience. Lucas reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and removed a weathered photograph protected inside a clear plastic sleeve. He handed it to me carefully. I immediately recognized my father standing beside three younger men on a dock, all smiling despite their rain-soaked clothing. One of them was unmistakably a much younger Lucas Jackson. On the back of the photograph, written in my father's familiar handwriting, were the words, "Some promises matter for life." Emotion tightened my throat as I gently traced the faded ink with one finger. My father had kept this memory hidden for more than a decade. Lucas quietly continued. When we offered Roy financial assistance, he refused. When we offered public recognition, he refused that too. The only thing he accepted was this matched pair of challenge coins. He glanced toward the coin still resting in my hand. Before we left Charleston, he asked for one promise instead. I found myself holding my breath without realizing it. Lucas repeated my father's exact words from memory. "If anything ever happens to my daughter, promise me she will never believe she is alone." Those words struck me harder than anything I had heard since my father's funeral. My eyes filled with tears I had spent months refusing to shed in front of anyone. The room blurred for a moment as I struggled to remain composed. One of the other operators quietly offered me a folded handkerchief without saying a word. The simple kindness reminded me so much of my father that I almost smiled through the tears. Across the room, I noticed something else. Deborah was no longer standing confidently with the buyers. She looked uncertain for the first time since my father died. She kept glancing between Lucas and the prospective homeowners, clearly realizing that whatever was happening had become far more significant than she had anticipated. Asher Roberts shifted uncomfortably before speaking. "Commander Jackson, I hope you understand that today's property transaction follows the documents currently available to us." Lucas nodded politely. "We understand completely. We are not here to interfere with lawful business." Deborah immediately relaxed, folding her arms again as though the conversation had finally turned back in her favor. "Exactly," she said quickly. "Everything has been handled legally." Lucas looked at her calmly before adding one final sentence. "That is precisely why another individual asked us to be present today." Confused murmurs spread through the office once again. Another individual. I looked toward Lucas. "Who?" Before he answered, the front entrance opened quietly. An older man carrying a worn leather briefcase stepped inside. His gray suit was neatly pressed, and his expression reflected the calm confidence of someone who had spent decades working with important documents. Asher Roberts immediately recognized him and straightened his posture. "Mr. Morris," he said with obvious surprise. "We were not expecting you today." The newcomer smiled politely. "I realize that. I was not expected because Timothy contacted me yesterday, and the title company confirmed this morning that Deborah was attempting to sign a purchase agreement without authority from the trust." He slowly walked toward me, stopping just a few feet away. "Miss Stewart, my name is Hudson Morris. I served as your father's estate attorney for many years." My heart skipped. "My father's attorney?" He nodded. "Roy instructed me that if a very specific condition was ever met, I was to personally deliver additional estate documents that remained sealed until that condition occurred." Every person in the room stared at the leather briefcase as Hudson carefully placed it on the conference table and released the brass locks with 2 quiet clicks. He looked directly at me before speaking words that instantly changed the atmosphere inside the office. "Miss Stewart, your father understood that grief, financial pressure, or confusion over the estate could place the house at risk before his instructions were fully recorded, and I believe the documents inside this briefcase are about to explain why Deborah does not possess the authority to sign today's purchase agreement." No one moved as Hudson Morris opened the worn leather briefcase and carefully removed a thick sealed envelope along with several neatly organized legal folders. The silence inside the office felt heavier than it had only moments earlier because everyone sensed that whatever was inside those documents carried far greater weight than another routine real estate transaction. Hudson adjusted his glasses before speaking in a measured, professional voice. "Roy instructed me to transfer beneficial ownership to Brittany once her nursing degree was verified. He separately directed me to reveal his private instructions in person if anyone attempted to sell or remove her from the residence before the transfer was formally recorded. Brittany completed her nursing degree last week, which activated her right to receive the property. Yesterday's attempt to remove her from the home, followed by today's proposed sale, activated Roy's second instruction. I was to appear personally, stop any unauthorized transaction, and deliver his sealed letters. He looked directly at me with quiet sympathy. I could hardly believe what I was hearing. My father had anticipated something like this years in advance. Deborah recovered first. She stepped forward with renewed confidence, forcing a polite smile. I appreciate your concern, Mr. Morris, but Roy's estate was already processed months ago. If there were additional documents, surely they would have appeared then. Hudson remained perfectly composed. Ordinarily, yes. However, these particular documents were intentionally excluded from the standard probate file under a lawful trust arrangement established before Roy's final illness. Asher Roberts immediately leaned forward with obvious professional interest. A trust arrangement? Hudson nodded. A revocable living trust that became irrevocable upon Roy's passing, with me serving as successor trustee until Brittany completed her nursing degree. He carefully removed another folder and placed it on the conference table. The recorded deed identifies the Stewart Family Educational Trust as the legal owner. Deborah was permitted to remain in the residence, but she was never granted authority to sell it. Quiet whispers spread across the room. I looked at the buyers standing beside Deborah. Their excitement had completely disappeared, replaced by cautious uncertainty. One of them quietly folded the sales brochure and slipped it into his briefcase without saying a word. Hudson opened the folder and continued. Under the terms established by Roy Stewart, the residence was transferred into the Stewart Family Educational Trust. The trustee was instructed to preserve the property until Brittany Stewart completed her nursing education. My heart pounded. My father had not simply hoped I would graduate. He had built an entire legal plan around that promise. Deborah shook her head immediately. That cannot possibly be correct. I had been paying taxes and maintaining that house for months. Hudson acknowledged her statement respectfully. You have indeed been residing in the property and managing certain household expenses. However, occupancy and ownership are two entirely different legal matters. He turned another page and pointed towards several notarized signatures. These documents clearly specify that no sale, transfer, refinancing, or permanent disposition of the property may occur before Brittany personally assumes ownership after completing her degree. Asher Roberts accepted the folder and silently reviewed several pages himself. His expression gradually changed from curiosity to concern. After another minute he slowly closed the file. These documents appear to be properly executed and notarized. He looked toward Deborah with visible discomfort. If they are authentic, we cannot continue today's closing. A long silence followed. Deborah stared at him in disbelief. You are stopping this agreement because of trust documents I was never allowed to control? Asher answered carefully. I am ending today's meeting. Until the title company verifies the trust and Hudson's authority as trustee, we cannot accept Deborah's signature on any purchase agreement. Based on what I have reviewed so far, proceeding today would expose everyone involved to significant legal complications. The prospective buyers quietly exchanged glances before one of them finally spoke. We appreciate your honesty. We would rather delay than purchase a property with unresolved ownership. They politely shook Asher's hand before stepping away from the conference table. Deborah's carefully controlled composure began slipping away. For months she had acted as though every decision had already been settled, but now each confident assumption seemed to disappear one by one. She looked toward me, perhaps expecting satisfaction or triumph, but the only emotion I honestly felt was disbelief. I had spent the past 8 months thinking my father had left nothing behind except memories. Instead, he had quietly continued protecting me even after his death. Hudson carefully removed one final document from the envelope. There is one additional instruction Roy asked me to read aloud once Brittany's ownership rights became active. My breathing slowed as every eye in the room returned to him. He unfolded the page and smiled faintly. This is not a legal document. It is a personal statement. He began reading in my father's unmistakably familiar words. Brittany, if you are hearing this, then you kept your promise to finish what you started. I always believed you would. A house is only wood, brick, and glass. What makes it a home is the character of the person living inside it. That is why I never wanted this place to become your reward. I wanted it to become your foundation. Tears blurred my vision again. It sounded exactly like him. Every sentence reflected the quiet wisdom that had guided me throughout my childhood. Hudson carefully folded the page after finishing and handed it to me. There is only one sealed item remaining, but Roy instructed me that it could be released only to the person carrying the brass key he placed inside Timothy's wooden box. I stared at him, then reached into my purse and removed the old brass key. Hudson turned the briefcase toward me, revealing a narrow lock hidden beneath the inner lining. The engraved number on the key matched the number beside the lock. When I inserted it, the mechanism opened with a quiet click, revealing a plain white envelope that had remained untouched since my father placed it there. Inside the newly opened compartment rested a plain white envelope with my name written across the front in my father's handwriting. Unlike the first letter Deborah had destroyed, this envelope carried a red wax seal that had never been broken. Hudson placed it gently into my hands. Roy instructed that no one except you was ever to open this letter. I looked down at the familiar handwriting while my fingers trembled slightly around the envelope. Before I could break the seal, Hudson quietly added one final sentence. Miss Stewart, your father believed this letter contained the truth that would matter most after everything else had been resolved. My hands trembled as I carefully broke the wax seal, not because I feared what my father had written, but because I knew these would be the last words he had ever chosen specifically for me. The room remained completely silent. Even the people who had entered only to buy a house now stood motionless, sensing that this moment belonged to something much larger than a legal dispute. I unfolded the pages slowly. The familiar handwriting immediately brought back memories of birthday cards, encouraging notes tucked into my lunchbox when I was little, and every handwritten reminder he had ever left on the refrigerator before leaving for work. It felt as though he were standing beside me again. I began reading quietly to myself. Brittany, if you are holding this letter, then life has probably become much harder than I ever wanted for you. First, I need you to know something that may surprise you. Whatever happened between you and Deborah after I was gone, do not assume it began with hatred. The truth is more complicated than that. I paused, confused. I glanced toward Deborah for only a moment before continuing. When I met Deborah, she was trying to keep her family together after years of financial hardship. Her younger sister needed expensive medical treatment, and her parents had already exhausted nearly everything they owned. I had the ability to help, and I chose to help because I believed that kindness should never come with conditions. I slowly lowered the paper for a moment, trying to process what I had just read. My father had never mentioned any of this. I looked toward Deborah again. She no longer appeared angry. Instead, she stared at the floor as though she already knew every sentence waiting on the next page. I continued reading. People may someday tell you that Deborah married me because of money. I do not believe that is true. I believe she cared for me in her own way. But grief changes people differently. Some become quieter. Some become stronger. Some become frightened. Fear often disguises itself as control. Those words settled heavily over the room. I thought back over the past 8 months. Deborah had controlled every conversation, every decision, every memory inside the house. Until now I had assumed it came from selfishness alone. My father seemed to be asking me to consider something much more uncomfortable. I turned the page. Brittany, before I became sick, I handled nearly every financial decision myself because I wanted Deborah to focus on rebuilding her own career. After I passed away, she suddenly found herself responsible for debts, paperwork, taxes, insurance, and countless responsibilities she had never expected to manage alone. I worried that fear might eventually convince her to mistake survival for success. A quiet sound broke the silence. Deborah covered her mouth with one hand, and for the first time since my father's funeral I saw tears forming in her eyes. She made no effort to hide them. Nobody spoke. There was nothing anyone could say. I continued reading. None of this excuses unkindness. If Deborah ever treats you unfairly, you must protect yourself. That is why I created the trust. I wanted you to have security no matter what happened. But I also ask one thing of you. Before you judge her forever, try to understand what fear can do to an imperfect person. I felt my throat tighten again. My father had somehow managed to protect me without teaching me to hate someone else. That realization affected me even more deeply than receiving the house itself. Halfway down the final page I reached a paragraph written in noticeably darker ink, as though he had added it later. There is one more truth you deserve to know. Deborah does not know I am telling you this because she never wanted you to carry the burden. During my illness, she quietly sold several pieces of jewelry that had belonged to her own mother to help pay medical bills that insurance would not fully cover. She never told me until afterward because she knew I would have objected. We disagreed about many things, but I never questioned her willingness to sacrifice when she believed someone she loved needed help. I looked up instinctively. Deborah had closed her eyes. Tears slipped silently down her face. The confident businesswoman who had stood so proudly outside the real estate office only an hour earlier seemed completely gone. She looked exhausted, overwhelmed, and deeply ashamed. Commander Lucas Jackson remained respectfully silent, allowing my father's words to accomplish what no lecture ever could. I reached the final paragraph. Brittany, if this letter reaches you, then you have already proven you are stronger than I ever was. You finished school. You honored your promise. The next decision belongs entirely to you. You have every legal right to protect what is yours. Just remember that the easiest decision is not always the one that lets you sleep peacefully years later. Whatever you choose the version of yourself you will still be proud of when you are my age. I folded the letter carefully, unable to speak for several seconds. The room remained silent until Deborah finally took one hesitant step toward me. She did not try to defend herself. She did not argue about the trust or the cancelled sale. Her voice barely rose above a whisper. Brittany, there is something I should have told you a long time ago, and after everything your father just said, I do not think I have the right to keep hiding it any longer. Deborah stood perfectly still, her hands trembling as she struggled to find the words she had apparently carried alone for months. When she finally looked at me, the confidence that had once defined every conversation between us had completely disappeared. The day after your father died, she said softly, I found another letter addressed to me. In it, Roy asked me to promise that I would never make you feel like you had lost both of your parents at the same time. She paused, lowering her eyes. I wish I could tell you that I kept that promise. I did not. Tears rolled down her face as she continued. I was terrified. I had never handled our finances by myself. Every bill reminded me that he was gone. Every room reminded me that I could not fix what had happened. Instead of asking for help, I convinced myself that controlling everything would keep my life from falling apart. But fear does not explain everything I did. I sold belongings that carried memories you had every right to keep. I destroyed a letter that belonged to you. And when I called you a burden, I was not protecting myself. I was choosing cruelty because it made me feel powerful for a few seconds. There is no excuse for that. I kept telling myself I was protecting my future, but somewhere along the way I stopped seeing yours. No one interrupted her. Even the prospective buyers remained quietly standing near the doorway, understanding that this conversation mattered more than any contract. Deborah reached into her purse and removed a small velvet pouch before placing it gently on the conference table. These are the keys to the house. Whatever I believed about ownership, I never had the right to lock you out of the place your father built as your home. She took a slow breath. I cannot undo what I said to you. I cannot erase the day I threw your suitcase outside. I will regret that for the rest of my life. She looked directly at me for the first time without anger, pride, or excuses. I am sorry, Brittany. I looked down at the house keys, then at my father's final letter still resting in my hands. Only a day earlier I had imagined this moment very differently. I thought reclaiming the house would feel like winning. Instead, it felt like standing at a crossroads where my father had somehow prepared me for both justice and compassion. Commander Lucas Jackson quietly stepped back with the other two Navy SEALs, giving us the space to decide what came next. Hudson Morris closed his briefcase without saying a word. The legal questions had been answered. Everything that remained belonged to the heart, not the courtroom. I picked up the keys and held them for several seconds before speaking. The trust gives me ownership of the house. Deborah nodded silently. Then I am asking you to respect that. I will. I took another breath. But I am not asking you to leave today. Her eyes widened in surprise. I continued before she could speak. I will give you 30 days to arrange another place to live. Hudson will put that agreement in writing, and during those 30 days neither of us will remove, sell, or alter anything belonging to the house without the other's knowledge. Compassion does not mean pretending yesterday never happened. It means giving you a fair amount of time while still protecting the home Dad intended me to have. Fresh tears filled her eyes. She tried to respond but could not immediately find the words. Finally, she whispered, "You sound exactly like your father." Hearing that hurt and comforted me at the same time. I smiled through my own tears. I hope that is true. Asher Roberts politely informed the buyers that the closing would officially be cancelled pending the updated ownership records. They shook my hand warmly before leaving, wishing me well instead of expressing disappointment. Hudson promised to complete the remaining legal paperwork over the next several days, while Lucas handed me a simple business card with only his name and office number printed on it. "Roy never wanted us to solve your problems," he said with a gentle smile. "He only wanted you to know that keeping your promises would never leave you completely alone." I thanked him, unsure how anyone could properly express gratitude for a promise kept over 11 years. Before leaving, Lucas and the two men who had accompanied him walked back toward the waiting vehicles exactly as quietly as they had arrived. There were no dramatic speeches, no celebration, and no applause. The neighbors simply watched in respectful silence as the vehicles pulled away and disappeared beyond the tree-lined entrance of the neighborhood. The street became quiet again, but the peace they left behind remained. 2 weeks later I began my first nursing position at Charleston Memorial Hospital. Every morning before work I unlocked the front door of the house my father had worked so hard to preserve. Deborah spent those weeks organizing her belongings while searching for a condominium closer to her salon. We shared dinners occasionally, sometimes speaking for hours, sometimes sitting quietly with memories that no longer felt like enemies. Healing did not happen all at once. Trust rarely returns as quickly as it disappears. But little by little, honesty replaced suspicion, and respect slowly returned where resentment had once lived. Over the following month, Deborah provided Hudson with a complete record of every item she had sold after Dad's death and agreed to repay the trust from her share of the remaining estate. She also began meeting with a grief counselor, not because forgiveness required it, but because she finally understood that regret without change was only another form of avoidance. On the morning she moved into her new home, Deborah handed me a framed photograph she had quietly kept hidden. It showed my father standing between the two of us during my high school graduation, smiling with the unmistakable pride that only he seemed capable of expressing. She looked at me gently and said, "Thank you for giving me the chance to become a better person than the one I became after he was gone." As I watched her drive away, I realized something my father had understood long before I did. Protecting someone does not always mean shielding them from hardship. Sometimes it means quietly giving them the opportunity to choose kindness when they finally have every reason not to. Closing reflection: perhaps the strongest people are not always the ones who win every argument or protect every possession. Sometimes strength appears much more quietly, in the moments when someone decides not to let pain become the only voice shaping the future. This story gently reminds us that grief rarely looks the same from one person to another. Some carry it with silence, others with fear, and others with mistakes they wish they could take back. There are times when justice is necessary, but there are also moments when understanding creates space for healing that punishment never could. Maybe the memories left behind by those we love are not measured by what they give us, but by the choices they continue inspiring long after they are gone. If you found yourself in Brittany's place, how would you have balanced protecting yourself with offering forgiveness? What part of this journey stayed with you the most, and what would your own decision have been if you had been standing at that same crossroads?